India and China have been normalizing their ties for 2000 years. I think both countries are trying to normalize the relationship, but that's a tricky, long process. It's really not easy given this is going to be a painful, slow process. And even then, there are no guarantees because there are structural reasons why the relationship is extremely difficult. One being that both these countries are rising countries. The second being that while they're rising, there is a tremendous asymmetry of power between these two countries. China is the world's biggest manufacturer. It's the biggest trading partner for 100 plus countries. It's an important neighbor for India. Trade between India and China is not a bad thing. Not because of just all of those reasons, but because I think trade with China can also help India achieve its developmental objectives. I think what he's doing is that he's trying to fast track a force which can be lethal, which can win conflicts. I think he's looking at conflicts around the world, whether it is Russia and Ukraine, whether it is Iran and Israel, and he's assessing, and they're assessing what kind of capabilities they need and what kind of challenges they face. We need to see if we can take a situation and push it to its extreme end, and then see what the other does, and then accordingly make plans. So what he's basically saying is that if the Chinese were to be far more assertive and aggressive, and let's game this out. If we are much more aggressive and assertive, what is the other side going to do? And accordingly, let's make our preparations, which to me is indicative of the thinking behind use of force. I think that Beijing is worried about escalation. The fact that things can go out of hand, is something that is a concern for China, because it can have broader regional implications. China has substantial investments in Pakistan, but it can have tremendous destabilization within the region, which can have an impact on Chinese national security, given that it borders these countries also. Also, at the same time, making sure that you can continue to leverage Pakistan to further your interests, but not get captured within the Pakistani objectives in the region, right? So don't let the tail wag the dog. And I think that sort of a situation for the Chinese also exists with Pakistan. So it's not as straightforward as we might think. On the night of the ceasefire, Wang Yi spoke to the Pakistani foreign minister and he spoke to Ajit Doval. The readouts from the Chinese side of both of those conversations were very interesting. When he spoke to Ajit Doval, he thanked him for achieving the ceasefire and said that China will do whatever it can do. There was no instruction. There was finally an acknowledgement of the terrorism that happened in Pahalgam. When he spoke to the Pakistani foreign minister, among other things which was standard where they talk about supporting Pakistan's sovereignty, he chided him on the idea that now that a ceasefire has been achieved, both sides must respect it. That was not something that he told Ajit Doval.
Welcome to StratNews Global. I'm Kirti Angre. And joining us today for a very special conversation on China and all things China is Manoj Kewalramani, who is the Chairperson of the Indo-Pacific Studies Programme at the Takshashila Institution. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. We're in June of 2025. It's a good time to talk about where we were 5 years ago with Galwan. And I want to start by asking you about where India-China things stand with these two countries 5 years from Galwan.
Right. Thank you so much for having me, Kirti. Look, I think where we stand is pretty much where we were somewhere in October last year. I think both countries are trying to normalize the relationship, but that's a tricky, long process. It's really not easy given, and it's evident, right? Because we're seeing some of the lowest of lowest hanging fruits are taking so much time to pluck. Things like establishing direct connectivity, things like visas. We've obviously had an agreement on the Kailash Mansarovar Yatra, so that's one positive. But some of these things which are sort of people-centered, low-hanging fruits are taking time to pluck, which just tells you that it's really difficult to go through the process of normalization. Each side has their points to make, and each side is driving a hard bargain. To me, I think I was speaking to a former diplomat some time back, and I think what he said summarizes the challenge of the India-China relationship. He was asked this question about normalizing ties with China, and he said, "Look, India and China have been normalizing their ties for 2000 years." So, to me, that summed up the idea that let's not try and look for grand breakthroughs, grand bargains. This is going to be a painful, slow process, and even then, there are no guarantees because there are structural reasons why the relationship is extremely difficult. One being that both these countries are rising countries. The second being that while they're rising, there is a tremendous asymmetry of power between these two countries. That asymmetry of power is relative in different domains. In the economic domain, it's different. In the military domain, it's different. In the technology domain, it's different. And then thirdly, we're clearly going through a massive change in the global order. We're not multipolar yet, but we're not unipolar, and we're not bipolar. So in some ways, there's no order, but in some ways, in some cases, the world is unipolar in terms of US military might. In some cases, the world is multipolar in terms of the US and China economically and technologically. Bipolar in terms of US and China. In some cases, it is multipolar. And that's what we're seeing, where, say, Israel can take certain actions, Turkey can take certain actions, Russia can take certain actions. So it's a really massive flux that's going on. And in this, I think both sides are sort of assessing where each other fits. And that's sort of, these three factors impinge on the relationship. The last point that I will make is that why this is difficult and why this process is going to be slow is that the power asymmetry that we talk about, people may push back on the argument that, look, 5 times greater GDP does not matter much on the border when it's man to man or things like that. And that's true in some ways, but also asymmetry creates certain perceptions. If you believe that you are a major global power, which is higher up in the hierarchy, which is what the Chinese believe, it's really something that you will not want to stand a regional power blocking your path. And you will believe that you can exert far greater force. So asymmetry also creates perceptions of how you can use power and what's the utility of the power that you've cultivated. So that's why we're going to see a difficult relationship riddled with friction, and any steps to normalization are going to be very narrow, interest-based. You're not going to see some bonhomie return.
Okay. And how much of this is impacted by President Xi Jinping's own position internally within China with the PLA, and how much of that really impacts how relationships play out, not just with India but globally too?
Yeah, I'm not necessarily certain that the domestic churn is such that the conventional theory that people argue is that, look, in some ways, when a dictator feels threatened internally, they tend to create external crises, right? I don't think that's what's happening in China right now. I don't think Xi Jinping's position is in danger. I think today he has elevated himself. He's no longer first among equals. He's at a different level compared to his other colleagues. He has obviously delegated functional responsibilities to other colleagues. So primarily Premier Li Qiang has taken a substantive role. I think that the PLA plays an important role, but the fact that Xi Jinping has been able to carry out quite a merciless anti-corruption campaign, even in the last couple of years, across the higher ups in the PLA, tells you, to me, that's a measure of control as opposed to a measure of threat that he's facing, right? The ability to be able to sacrifice people that high in the totem pole who are seen as loyalists because of issues of corruption or incompetence or inability to achieve targets. To me, that is actually a signal of strength, of his own comfort in his own position. That said, it's also an indicator of fundamental lack of preparedness, lack of sort of readiness for combat, fundamental deeper political flux within the PLA. So, so yes, you might argue that to be able to deal with that, he might launch some sort of military adventures, or there might be use of force. But I don't think that resolves that internal turmoil that's taking place within the PLA. There's clearly a factional struggle that's taking place. There's a Fujian gang, there's a Shaanxi gang, and you can see the people who've been sacked, where they are aligned, and that's relating to the senior ups in the Central Military Commission. But I don't think that threatens Xi Jinping's position, right? I think what he's doing is that he's trying to fast track a force which can be lethal, which can win conflicts. I think he's looking at conflicts around the world, whether it is Russia and Ukraine, whether it is Iran and Israel. And I think there's a certain degree of surprise that the Chinese have been caught by with what's happening between Iran and Israel. And they're assessing what kind of capabilities they'd need and what kind of challenges they'd face. So I don't think, therefore, the use of force is related to political turmoil within the PLA. I think the use of force is related to perceptions of power and the need to push boundaries. I'll end with this. Soon after the 20th Party Congress in 2022 October, in 2023 May, the first meeting of the National Security Commission after the party congress was held. And Xi Jinping used an interesting phrase which translates to, we must prepare with extreme case scenarios. When people read that, initially they thought that that would mean that the Chinese are deeply worried. They feel a sense of greater threat. But what he actually meant, and later writings of Chinese strategists, PLA officials told us, what he actually meant was that we need to see if we can take a situation and push it to its extreme end, and then see what the other does, and then accordingly make plans. So what he's basically saying is that if the Chinese were to be far more assertive and aggressive, and let's game this out. If we are much more aggressive and assertive, what is the other side going to do? And accordingly, let's make our preparations, which to me is indicative of the thinking behind use of force.
Right. Now, when you said that, there's one thing that is written and then there's so much of interpretation that follows, it's a great segue to actually go into the white paper on national security. It's, the term is sort of all-encompassing. It's so broad. It includes everything from science and tech to even culture. It's the first of its kind in how holistic it is. Let's talk a little bit about the white paper. How do you read it? Because, like you said, it says one thing, but sometimes the meanings are quite hidden.
Yeah, I mean, in case of this white paper, to me, it's useful because it gives you, everything that's in Chinese thinking or articulation over the last 7, 8, 10 years in one place, right? So it, like you rightly pointed out, it makes the case for holistic view on national security. And Xi Jinping had articulated his concept of national security a decade or so ago, but he basically made the case that, look, everything needs to be prioritized from a security perspective, even economic growth. And this paper is reflective of that. This paper is also reflective of Chinese thinking with regard to, say, its external environment and the threat that the US presents, color revolutions that the US can sort of engineer, this ideological threat from the West. It represents sort of all of that, right? So to me, it's not a new articulation. It actually consolidates a lot of thinking around national security within one document. So one would then assume, well, why do you need to do this if you're not making any new arguments, if you're not making any new commitments, or if you're not making any new declarations to the world? Why put out a document like this? To me, the purpose of this document is primarily domestic. I think for the longest time, the Chinese leadership has been trying to get different fragments of their bureaucracy, to act in sort of concert with each other. This is typical of any system. So if you look at a country like India, the country like the United States, you have different bureaucracies. Bureaucracies have their own interests. They pursue their own interests and agenda, despite what the leadership's agenda might be. Now, as much as we think of the Chinese system as a unitary system where, essentially the brain thinks, which is the top leadership, the hand moves and the fingers operate accordingly, it's not really that way. It is a fragmented system where you have different levels of fragmentation, horizontally at the central level and vertically across different levels of government. So what you therefore get is different entities pursuing different sets of interest. If you're the Ministry of Commerce, if you're the Ministry of Finance, your goals are very different from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of National Defense. Now, this articulation of national security in this comprehensive format is to try and bring actions in concert and to try and make the case that, look, security is cross-cutting and everybody needs to be on the same page in this. So whether you are the Ministry of Agriculture, your priority is food security. So you need to look at food from a securitized lens. Likewise, if you are the Ministry of Commerce and you're dealing with trade, your priority is securitizing trade. And for that, you need to act with other entities, right? So to me, that's the primary objective of the paper, is to domestically signal that this is going to be the policy pathway going forward. It doesn't make any specific grand new statements internationally. For people who are reading Chinese content on a daily basis, policy documents, it's not new at all. The purpose is to domestically mobilize the system to act in concert. The one thing that's interesting is that this paper, for somebody who's studying China, gives you a sense of the architecture of national security that's being built. And that architecture is beyond national defense. It covers all these different areas. It also tells you about the thinking behind the new legislation that we're likely to see. So the paper specifically makes a case that we need a set of new laws with regard to national security. And if you just go back sort of 5-7 years from today, what you will see is that in those 5-7 years, you've had the Chinese built up a new sort of economic toolkit, which includes an unreliable entities list, which includes export controls, which includes a foreign sanctions legislation, which includes a foreign trade legislation, and those sorts of things. So I think that what you're seeing is the Chinese recognizing that across the board, security is your primary objective. And you need to everybody needs to get in the same pace, and which will mean that on certain areas, your goals of economic development and growth will be hampered because security is paramount.
Okay. Now coming a little bit back to India, China, what is the way forward really for these two countries? Because it's not like our trade is falling. And there are a lot of dependencies we do have, say, in a sector like pharma, for example. So, given this, and yes, the Kailash Mansarovar Yatra is a great step forward, but given these dependencies, what is then the way forward for India and China?
Look, I am of the view that trade between India and China is not a bad thing. I think that China is the world's biggest manufacturer. It's the biggest trading partner for 100 plus countries. It's an important neighbor for India. Trade between India and China is not a bad thing. Not because of just all of those reasons, but because I think trade with China can also help India achieve its developmental objectives. That's my primary sort of concern, that's what we need to achieve. Secondly, trade can act as a bit of a ballast, right? But when relations are difficult, trade can be very useful. And we're seeing that in the US-China case also, right? Economic linkages make it difficult to have scraps in the military domain. And I think that that's a good thing. Now, there is obviously this case of dependencies that is important to take into account. To my mind, the idea of de-risking is something that India has to sort of evolve. I think we have not necessarily thought through what our approach to de-risking might be. And let me give you an example. All dependencies are not bad. Some dependencies are useful, right? Because it also creates constituencies on either side for stability. And all dependencies need not be deeply problematic. If India imports a significant amount of capital goods from China, they contribute to Indian exports. So that's not a bad thing. Where dependencies are problematic is when they become vulnerabilities. So how does a dependency become a vulnerability? Well, when you're excessively dependent on a particular entity, the question then arises, what is excessive? To my mind, and my colleagues have made this argument also, that China sort of contributes about 30% of global trade. If India is importing a particular product which is well above 30%, India's import dependence on China, that product is well above 30%, then that's a case to start thinking about vulnerabilities. Now, all vulnerabilities don't require government action, right? So if we are importing 70% of our toys from China, well, that does not require government action. Yes, it's hurting toy manufacturers in India, but they need to figure out how to become much more competitive, right? It's not necessarily hurting strategically the country's security. But if you are importing 80%, 70% of your APS, that's a problem, right? Because health has a cascading effect on society. So what do you need to do for that? You need to devise a de-risking strategy. And part of that has to be government intervention to try and potentially raise the costs of APIs or to incentivize Indian pharmaceutical companies to invest in the country. For that, you might have some sort of subsidy schemes, or you might liberalize your exports, and you might have different deals with different countries to sort of invite Indian pharmaceutical products, or so you can have a set of different things that you can do to try and reduce that level of dependencies. And in that, you'll have to engage industry. So I think it's firstly important to study which sectors do we have high levels of dependencies, which of those dependencies impact India's strategic interests or security, and then start to think about, well, what is the sort of diversified de-risking operations that can be done. In some cases, you can partner with third countries to try and create a secure supply chain. That does not mean you stop importing from China. You still take the price advantage from China, but you might mandate that a certain percentage of this must come from secure supply chains. So that could just be a policy decision that the government makes, which is passed down to industry. So there are different types of things that you can do to try and deal with those vulnerabilities. But all dependencies are not bad, right? Toys is the best example that I can give you. It's not a problem at all. And I think we should think of it from that point of view. At the end of the day, no action that we take should fundamentally hurt India's development pathway. Because if you don't have development and economic growth, that asymmetry with China is also going to exacerbate, and it's going to hurt us strategically much more. So this needs to be much more carefully calibrated.
When you say carefully calibrated, there's one thing that immediately comes to mind, which is that this really emotional overreach, which Indians have, that let's boycott all Chinese goods, because this is a country that is actually arming our neighbors, and so those are two different things. One is the emotional aspect of wanting to, boycott China and hurt China, and the other is the fact that China is arming our neighbors. And if you could take both those things.
Yeah. Yeah, look, I mean, we're an emotional people, right? So that's likely to happen. I think that the thing to keep in mind is, at the same time, we're an emotional people. I agree with that, but also we're a practical set of people, right? So as much as after Galwan, and that's, this image is stuck in my head of somebody who threw their television set out of the, their window, I don't know, 7 or 8 story window, as an act of protest. I think at the same time, you didn't see broadly, imports go down from China. So as much as there is this emotional outburst, there is also practical pragmatism that exists within the Indian mind, and I think that is important. Look, in terms of China arming our neighbors, it's a problem, right? And it's a problem that we've known. It's not that China's arms sales to Pakistan or joint development of fighter jets or China's provision of submarines to Pakistan is something that we've not known. We've known that it's part of their business model. Pakistan is their biggest client, but China is also supplying with arms to Myanmar, to Bangladesh. There's also naval cooperation with Bangladesh, and that was going on even before this current regime in Bangladesh, right? I think, look, this is something that we need to learn to live with. And what we need to try and do is we need to see if we can also create leverage points within China's periphery. So therefore, we must not be coy about operating within South China Sea. We must, and we aren't, right? We aren't coy about selling weapons to Vietnam, with whom we have a line of credit for defense supplies. I don't think India is coy about selling the BrahMos missiles to the Philippines. So I think that this is the only way to deal with some of this is to, yes, you have to talk to the Chinese about some of these issues, and you might not get anywhere, but it's part of dialogue that must be there. At the same time, you need to build leverage within China's periphery. And I think along with that, you need to work with international partners. I think part of Indian policy needs to not only be about strengthening itself, that's the heart of the policy that I think India should follow, but also to be able to strengthen counterbalancing forces with regard to China. Now, that means working with the US, that means working with Japan, that means working with Australia, with France, with Germany, countries that have vested interest in having a counterbalancing action. Right? I don't think we should be as coy on that as we have been in the past.
When you say counterbalancing, it's something that was often spoken of in the context of the world wanting to sort of reduce its dependency on China and look to other countries. India was one of those, Vietnam is another. But do we think that it is something where we can actually fill in that gap, or is it a realistic expectation that we are an alternative?
Look, I don't think we should look at ourselves as an alternative. I think we should look at ourselves from the perspective of our own goals. In different segments, we are alternatives. So, for example, when it comes to certain critical technologies, we can potentially be an alternative. And that's why you see the India-US relationship with ISET and the upgraded trust now with Trump indicates that there is a continuation when it comes to a critical technology dialogue with India, which is not necessarily the same with, say, the US and Vietnam. But when it comes to sort of low-end manufacturing, it's going to be highly competitive, right? And we are going to be able to do much more domestically to be able to try and attract some of that low-end manufacturing. I think for that, we need to look at our factor market policies in India, whether it's land, labor, energy supplies, water supply, and things like that. At the same time, we need to look at our export policies. Do we want those companies that maybe wanted to move from China to invest in India for India, or do we want to be able to facilitate exports for them? So there will be lots of those changes that we need to make domestically to become an attractive destination, to be able to get some of the movement that's happening out of China to India. In that low-end manufacturing domain, I think we will face and we continue to face stiff competition. Whether it's Bangladesh, of course, right now is going through a churn, but Cambodia, Vietnam are entities which are going to give us stiff competition. But in certain other areas where you need to have solid political trust, whether it is semiconductors, whether it is critical minerals, those are the kind of areas where I think you can probably make quicker breakthroughs. If you have a if you have deeper political proximity, and we've seen some movement on that, right? We've got an alliance, semiconductor alliance with the Quad countries. We've got a critical minerals regime that we're talking about. Even the G7 has a critical minerals sort of platform. So I think that those are areas where we can have probably quicker breakthroughs. Whereas this other stuff on low-end manufacturing will be far more competitive.
Okay. And when you see China forging these partnerships with a lot of countries, say even in Africa, those are strategic partnerships, but there's also so much of military involvement in it. In the context of India, how does India counter that or complement that?
Look, I don't think we need to necessarily counter Chinese engagement in Africa. I think we need to think about what our interests are. And again, I think all our foreign policy should fundamentally be based around what is in India's interests, rather than necessarily countering China. Where we need to counterbalance China is to be able to. So my approach to counterbalancing China is fundamentally about trying to create trying to create sufficient amount of pressure and leverage for us. So you work with your partners to be able to create sufficient amount of pressure and leverage points that we can shape China's behavior potentially, but if not, we can at least use them as tools of bargaining with China, right? So Africa to me does not, in my mind, doesn't necessarily fall into that bracket. Partly because I think the comparative advantage the Chinese have of engagement in Africa is far greater than what we have, or even what the West has. I think the Chinese, historically, have had a close relationship with African countries. If you look at Chinese diplomacy, the first visit by a Chinese foreign minister for now nearly 3+ decades is always to African countries, and that's part of their tradition. They have tremendous development assistance that they've provided. They've engaged in tremendous development projects. There is friction in those projects, yes, but there has been demonstrable sort of outcomes that they've achieved, and I think we should acknowledge that. From a security cooperation point of view, I think China is involved in enhancing African countries' security infrastructure, providing some degree of arms, doing joint training. But I think China is also very cautious about how it engages in Africa. It doesn't want to get caught up in external conflicts. Um, and I think that's part of their approach. So I don't see the need for India to counter. Where India has interests, whether it is in trade with Africa, whether it is in minerals, whether it is in natural sort of raw material products and things like that, whether it is in export markets, those are the kind of things that India should be engaging in rather than necessarily thinking about countering China. Because I don't think that's our goal.
One of the things you said right now was that we need our partners to sort of stand up with us, stand with us. But it's something that I don't think we've really seen, say, post Operation Sindoor, for example,
Hmm.
and that is also worrying because China was arming Pakistan. We knew about it. There's nothing new about it. But
Hmm.
China also is just sitting pretty while India is keeping itself busy on one flank.
Yeah. So, look, on the issue of our partner standing with us, I think it's really important to understand that strategic autonomy cuts both ways. Strategic autonomy does not just cut for you, right? So, while you are free to say that I will stand on my side and on my interests, so are others. So, yes, you will have this set of friction. We're in a world where the idea, till some years ago, you would hear this argument from Western countries about values. I don't think today the logic of values stands anymore. And I don't think from an Indian perspective, if you see Indian diplomacy just within under this government, I don't think you've seen that values-based argument. You know, interests have always trumped. I think that cuts both ways. You will see other countries also cutting deals with others where their interests align. I think what we need to keep in mind is that our interests with our partners on China broadly align. They may not be entirely, the same, but there is substantive similarities. Whether it is with the U.S., whether it is with the European countries, Japan, Australia, France, and so on and so forth. That is an impetus for your joint action, right? In that also there are differences. US policy on Taiwan is very different from India's policy on Taiwan, and that's likely to remain. um, I think one of the things in India that we've been doing is that even after Operation Sindoor, this need to try and explain ourselves and to get some degree of, some degree of a nod from the world. To me, that world has passed. There's no longer the need for, you might want to, but there's no longer necessarily the need for dossier diplomacy and things like that. To me, that world has somewhere passed, and we're seeing it unfold between Israel and Iran. Israel has not made a legal case, you know, and I think that, I'm not saying that's a great place to be in, that's a great world to be in, or that's a safer world to be in. I'm just saying that's how the world is, unfortunately, today. Um, that opens up certain opportunities for India in terms of the actions that it might take, but it also means that there is far more wisdom required on all sides to be able to use force responsibly and things like that. So to me, the lack of criticism of India on Operation Sindoor, the lack of any, criticism from, say, the extreme left or the extreme right in the West, tells you that there was an understanding that this is what India will do. There's only limited things that we can do, um, and I don't think there's been any cost imposed on India. So to me, that's a success of our diplomacy over the decades, and it's also a reflection of the global order. So I don't see necessarily any sort of concern with our friends and partners not standing with us. I think they've generally stood by, to the extent that their interests have permitted them. I think that on China, I think that in some way in India we've misunderstood the Chinese imperative. Yes, I agree that that Beijing is very happy if India is occupied with its Western neighbor. Um, but at the same time, and I think Beijing also doesn't mind limited localized frictions to sustain it. Allows India to remain not locked in, not just towards its Western neighbor, but also focus much more on continental security as opposed to maritime security. But I think that Beijing is worried about escalation. The fact that things can go out of hand, is something that is a concern for China, because it can have broader regional implications. China has substantial investments in Pakistan, but it can have tremendous destabilization within the region, which can have an impact on Chinese national security, given that it borders these countries also. So I think that there is a concern about the nature of escalation. I'll end with this. On the night of the ceasefire, Wang Yi spoke to the Pakistani foreign minister and he spoke to Ajit Doval. The readouts from the Chinese side of both of those conversations were very interesting. When he spoke to Ajit Doval, he thanked him for achieving the ceasefire and said that China will do whatever it can do. There was no instruction. There was finally an acknowledgement of the terrorism that happened in Pahalgam. When he spoke to the Pakistani foreign minister, among other things which was standard where they talk about supporting Pakistan's sovereignty, um, he chided him on the idea that now that a ceasefire has been achieved, both sides must respect it. That was not something that he told Ajit Doval. And this is the Chinese readout of the conversation. So he was clearly sending a message to the Pakistani side that, look, you must respect this now, because otherwise it's not appreciated even in Beijing. So I think that it's worth for us to understand that Beijing has multiple objectives in this also. Finally, actually, I should end with this: the China-Pakistan relationship. We tend to see it as, yes, I think Pakistan is a client state. Yes, at the same time, Pakistan is quite adept at maintaining multiple, patrons. The US being one of them. It's historically done that. Um, from the Chinese perspective, the balance is also who are the other patrons, and what leverage do you have on Pakistan. Also, at the same time, making sure that you can continue to leverage Pakistan to further your interests, but not get captured within the Pakistani objectives in the region, right? So don't let the tail wag the dog. And I think that that sort of a situation for the Chinese also exists with Pakistan. So it's not as straightforward as we might think.
All right. A quick word on a recent survey conducted among Chinese and whether, what is the likelihood of them being okay with the conflict with India along the border versus, reunification of Taiwan, and whatever the sample size, and there could be, we can
Yeah.
talk about that separately, but whatever the sample size, Chinese seem more than half of the population that was interviewed for this or surveyed for this were somehow okay with the conflict with India, but they were not really okay with the reunification of Taiwan being done by force.
Yeah, I think that was an interesting survey, and perhaps it's an outlier. but it was an interesting survey. To me, what it tells us is that over the last decade, the relationship with India in the public conception and public imagination has become much more hostile. I lived in China, till 2016, 2017, and I didn't see any sense of hostility among the general public. I think there was a acknowledgement of India being a fellow Asian power, and there were times where you would walk around the streets and you would randomly hear even Bollywood songs and people dancing to them. So I think from a public perception point of view, it wasn't necessarily a hostile relationship. Even the memory of the 1962 war did not really exist in the broader public. It's not taught. It was not taught in history books and things like that. For, of course, the elite who were within the media and strategic affairs community, there was an acknowledgement that the relationship with India is difficult. Um, but I think that that's changed. And I think post Galwan, that's changed not just because of the incident at the standoff, but I think it's also changed because there's been a change in how the Chinese have talked about the relationship to the broader public. There are examples of, references to Galwan within school textbooks. There is examples of, uh, history textbooks talking about the 1962 war again. There's much more social media commentary, which is very critical of India. So I think that on the whole, the relationship and the hostility in the relationship has started to sort of somewhere seep into the broader public imagination. Um, and I think to me that's not a good thing, right? But it's also tells you that it's a purposeful thing, that the Chinese state has permitted this to happen. Otherwise, for the decades that the 1962 war did not reflect, they didn't allow it to happen. So I think that's not necessarily a great thing for the stability in the relationship in the long term. That you have a sense of hostility with each other. So I think that to me, that's what that survey really indicates. The other part of it on Taiwan, look, I think most Chinese wouldn't want to see war because the sense of it's a dual strategy, right? At one level, the Chinese state articulates that Taiwan is compatriots. They are brothers. We have blood ties. We are kin. It's always difficult to be seeing bombs fall on people with whom you share blood ties. So that sort of conflict will be extremely difficult. Therefore, I think for people like me who tend to watch Chinese discourse around conflict, it's useful to observe what is the nature of demonization and the othering of the people on the other side. Um, and I think what you see in Chinese discourse today is that there is an othering of the DPP in Taiwan, and politicians of the DPP, particularly Lai Ching-te. At the same time, there is the othering of people who are seen as colluding with the West. And these are seen as evil, who are creating troubles and things like that. But for the broader public, that argument of, hey, look, we need to have cross-strait development, we are compatriots, and we need to have Taiwanese youth invested in China, we need to create opportunities for them, that sort of persists side by side. So I'm not surprised, therefore, that if survey results find that people would want to not see war with Taiwan and would rather prefer peaceful reunification. But whereas with India, conflict would be far more palatable because I think those ties don't exist. And in fact, whatever uh, good senses and good feelings existed have started to erode over the last 5-7 years. So that tells you that you need to have probably far more engagement between the two societies, because you can't have hostility at this level. I just parallel to India, right? I'm sure you remember, when Manmohan Singh was prime minister, he talked about making Mumbai Shanghai, and then there was this ugly phrase Chindia, which was used at that point of time, and there was a sort of positive demonstration effect that China's development had for the Indian psyche. In India, that's gone today, right? People don't necessarily look at China and think of it positively. So I think there's a parallel there, but in the Chinese case, I think it's happened because the state has permitted it to happen because the state controls it.
Right. Now moving to the China and US trade deal. Donald Trump declared it was a done deal. The Chinese side didn't really react also to it, and then there was one statement: "Is it a done deal?"
It would be very, very risky to put myself in a position where I anticipate what Donald Trump is thinking and doing. But I don't think it's a done deal. I think that what you're seeing, So there are two ways of looking at it, right? And I oscillate myself between those two ways. At one side, it seems like both sides are running on a treadmill. Both sides are losing value but getting nowhere. On the other side, I think that it sort of is a case where there has actually been some salvos shared. So, and you're trying to test how far you can push the other, and what are the costs that the other side is willing to bear. And what you saw since Liberation Day till the deal in London is that in some ways the cost to US industry, the Chinese rare earth use, the cost to US industry can be sharp. And if the US wants to aggressively target China on trade and technology issues, and it wants to blunt this rare earth tool that the Chinese have used, it needs to do multiple things. It needs to encourage its industry to have longer term reserves. It needs to build stockpiles, perhaps nationally. It might want to have some sort of diversification of supply chains, and that will have to mean, long-term investments. So it'll have to build that reserve if it wants to give, blunt this particular tool. It's not like it can't be blunted, but there are steps that you need to take. From the Chinese point of view, I think there's a realization that you have this one critical tool that you can use. You can potentially use your market, but that is also going to hurt you. You need to diversify your trade, which is what they have tried to do. And data from this last 5 months shows you that they've diversified their trade. You need to divert that trade. So it's eventually still going to the US, but it's going through third countries. So there are these other things that you need to do. But primarily, you need to make sure that the impact on jobs in China is as limited as possible, because that can be politically salient from a stability point of view. So I think both sides are figuring out what's the level of pain that either can bear, and if there is a certain amount of pain, what do you end up doing to deal with that? What's your sort of band-aid solution? What's your long-term solution? So in that sense, yes, there is some progress in this friction. Strategically, I think we are moving towards gradual decoupling of certain domains, particularly in core technologies. In London, I don't think either side really gave too much away. I don't think even the US gave too much away. It's, restrictions on the high-end chips still remain. Its restrictions with partners on chip technology to China still remains. And so that's not changed. So to me, we've not really had a deal. Tariffs were down. They're at the same level where they are. The US at 55%, the Chinese at about 35%. So you've not really moved. What you've done is that you've inflicted some amount of pain. You've figured out where it hurts, how to try and resolve that. And you need to do that before you perhaps go to another round. And I'm 110% sure there will be another round of this friction. And then we'll see where we go from that and which city in Europe potentially that takes us to.
And what about rare earths? Because Reuters reported a couple of days ago that China has really not yielded on that, and there still controls for exports, particularly for the things that the US military needs.
Yeah, look, I think some of those will continue to remain. There will be selective easing that the Chinese are doing on rare earths, and I think that will continue to happen. But they've noticed that this is a leverage that they have, and they are going to continue to use that. And the argument that they will keep using is, that we are essentially preventing end use of military, end military use, which is the argument that the United States also has used with regard to its semiconductor controls. That we want to protect high-end chips from military use. So the Chinese will use that argument very legitimately, and like I said, they've developed a toolkit of economic of laws and things like that to be able to do that. So they will make the case that what we are doing is lawful because it's driven by Chinese law. So I don't think that's going to ease. But what's going to ease is that you're going to supply to industry, because at the end of the day, if you have a resource, any resource, and in this case rare earths, you need to sell it to somebody. Otherwise, what's the point of that resource, right? The resource needs to be monetized eventually. So in this friction that we saw in the last few months, even Chinese rare earth sellers were going back to the government and saying, hey, look, we're losing market, we're losing value, we're losing revenue. So it again tells you that any of these tools of economic coercion can only be used so far. The only way where they are successful is if the pain inflicted on the other is far greater than the pain that you suffer, right? And to me, both have limited capacity for pain. So therefore, you'll see this sort of rubber band style pushing and snapping back, pushing and snapping back. And potentially in that process, the rubber band gets a little bit much more looser, right? It loses some elasticity. And I think that's where we are at. So yeah, the Chinese will continue to use it. I think from an Indian perspective, we need to think far more deeply about how this Chinese economic toolkit, even if deployed against the US, can and will have downstream effects on our industries. So we need to sit and map out which are the industries where we are critically dependent, strategically dependent. Um, in some cases, government might need to do certain things. In some cases, it's just useful for the government to signal to industry and say, look, guys, you need to get your act together. You need to get stockpiles. You need to make sure that you diversify your supply chain. It's not for government to come in and constantly bail industry out. So I think, in like say in the case of rare earths, to me at this point of time, it's a political issue. I think governments need to step in. But down the road, the long-term strategies for the industry to go and diversify, whether you look for alternative materials, whether you look for alternative sources of rare earths, whether you look for stockpiling, whatever you do, or whether you look build in domestic capacity, I think that sort of set comes from industry, and industry will have to take the lead.
All right. Thank you so much for taking the time. Very, very this discussion was insightful, and thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for staying with StratNews Global. For insightful discussions like these, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel and also click the bell icon so you never miss another video from StratNews Global.